as we get closer to the release of the War Within, and even one day away from the release of the pre-patch of the next expansion, of course, more and more players will start getting interested into looking into which specs to play for the next expansion, which specs are looking good, which specs are being powerful and played in the beta, for example, right? So for today, we're not actually doing something nearly as detailed and as precise related to the power level of the specs. Instead, we're simply looking at how safe it is to choose a certain spec or a certain class. How much are you risking to be benched forever in the new expansion by playing a certain spec? Because there can be differences. For example, one spec right now might be rated highly because of their power in the raid, but not nearly as much for the power in Mythic Plus, so you're risking way more if you're more interested in Mythic Plus. There could be problems about playability in the whole class. For example, you are deciding between Ret and Destro. Except if Ret Paladin is terrible, you have no other option if you want to play a DPS than to reroll an entire class, whereas if Destro is being poor, you can still get bailed out by either Demo or Affliction doing well, for example. Then you have the possible problem of compositions. What happens if Ret is considered S tier, but also Prot Paladin is considered S tier? It is very unlikely, historically, that Mythic Plus compositions are going to include two specs of the same class. So now it's kind of risky to pick one of these two because one might be cancelled by the other, becoming the meta option, for example. That is what we are looking into for today, less so about the straight up tier list of who is doing well. Because, we have looked already at things like DPS results in the beta, even the Mythic Plus results in the beta, so doing things like, hey, Arcane is S tier, the DK specs are S tier, why not chunk in some Elemental Shaman into S tier? And of course, as usual, Augmentation continues to be OP, that's it, that's the tier list, it's done. Instead, we are looking at something a bit more broad and not just their power. So, talking about right now the situation when it comes to the tanks. We have looked already at the power level of tanks a few days ago, and the situation right now is as follows. To main a Brewmaster Monk, you would have to have severe gambling problems, for a couple of reasons. Number one, Brewmaster's changes in the beta have not exactly made them that much better in Mythic Plus and that much better at dealing with very high, heavy damage with their stagger. Plus, you continue to have Mistweaver Monk looking quite good, which would make them harder for them to find a spot in Mythic Plus. You have to be a gacha enthusiast to bet on Prot Paladin and Guardian Druid. The reasons being that at the moment, for starters, Prot Paladin is not looking that great. Guardian Druid was looking slightly better, but they do have a few issues, both of them. One is that Holy Paladin at the moment is the strongest healer across the board, also in Mythic Plus, which makes it harder to imagine Prot Paladin becoming a meta option. We have seen before situations in Mythic Plus where we just don't see two specs of the same class being meta at the same time. Right? We have gone through, 12 different seasons of Mythic Plus across 3 different expansions, and the only time it happened for a few weeks was the power of Outlaw, sometimes group bringing double Outlaw Rogue and the Havoc Demon Hunter in their Mythic Plus group, for example. But besides that, it's very rare to see two specs of the same class in the same group. So not only the specs are looking the best right now, but also they are the specs in the same class of the two best, for the moment, Mythic Plus healers, for example. In this case, Holy Paladin and Restoration Druid. So it would make their chance to be a safe pick, especially if you're into Mythic Plus, much harder. For Vengeance, it's not nearly as bad because Havoc is not looking nearly as good. So it's a high risk pick to go for Vengeance, but because Havoc is not at the moment one of the strongest, or even close to one of the strongest DPS specs, especially in Mythic Plus, then you can have high chances, you can have a high return in picking Vengeance Demon Hunter. Same goes for the raid, you always want one spot for a Demon Hunter because of the magical damage debuff in the raid, so perhaps Havoc might be weak enough that Vengeance gets to find a free spot in the raid. However, it is still high risk, because if Havoc ends up being brought in the raid, for example, then you will not be having a spot in the raid as a Vengeance Demon Hunter. The ones who are more safe are Prot Warrior and Blood DK. Prot Warrior is at the moment on a safe pension fund, mostly because Arms at the moment is not doing too well. They have the risk, considering how Fury is doing well right now, especially in Mythic Plus, especially with their AoE, burst, damage. They might become an item in Mythic Plus, which might hurt Prot Warrior's chances in Mythic Plus, which is similar. It is similar to Blood DK. Blood DK has been doing very well in the beta, but as we are about to see when it comes to the DPS, the other DK specs are also doing very well. So you do still have a high return chance as a Blood DK because you have been a staple very often in the raid as an option, and also if you like to bet on history. The history tells us that there's never been one time in the entirety of the past 3 expansions and over a dozen tiers where Unholy or Frost have been meta in Mythic Plus. They have been, in fact, the worst DPS specs in Mythic Plus, together with Feral Druid, for basically 6 years. So if you like to bet on that for Mythic Plus and being rather safe for the raid, then it's a decent choice as a tank. Then enter the healers. We have also done our research on the state of the healers right now. Now, especially for the Mythic Plus enthusiasts, you would have to be a gacha addict or a borderline severe gambler to go for Preservation Evoker. Because augmentation exists. This has been a problem ever since augmentation was created. Preservation has felt the damage done by augmentation being meta and will continue to suffer this problem in the War Within. They have definitely a slightly larger chance to become viable, to have a spot in the raid, but when it comes to Mythic Plus, it's much lower down, given the current power of augmentation. In terms of power levels, definitely Holy Paladin and Resto Druid at the very top, because they don't have a particularly very strong spec in their class doing well right now, and they themselves are doing very well right now. So they are one of the more safe options, especially for Mythic Plus, but also for the raid. They are pretty safe given how powerful they are right now, and not having, Ret or Balance or Feral being very good right now. So their chances are much higher at becoming an item. Somewhat similar for Mysterious Monk. It's a very stable option given their power in the raid especially, but also in Mythic Plus. Neither Windwalker or Brewmaster are excelling that much right now, so Mistweaver also has pretty decent options. Meanwhile, these other 3 specs stay exactly where they are. For the 2 healer specs staying in here, they are high risk, high return, because Shadow Priest right now is doing quite badly. So they don't risk getting blocked like they have been for the practically second half of Dragonflight, because of the power of Shadow killing the options of healing priests in their comps. But they are not doing that well themselves right now, and they are being weaker, for example, than these specs. So they are high risk because they risk being closed out by these other specs, but they are high return, because if they end up being good, it's likely they will be a staple option, because Shadow Priest at the moment is not doing very well. Resto Shaman stays in high risk, high return, even if at the moment are doing significantly well than both the priest specs. If this was an actual tier list of power, then Resto Shaman would be here. Resto Shaman perhaps would even be tying Resto Druid. The problem is that what we will see in the DPS, Enhancement and Elemental right now are doing very well, which puts the value of Resto Shaman at risk. Now, talking about the DPS, let's get rid of the gamblers in this list. Based on the tuning the specs have received so far in the beta, the amount of changes specs have received so far in the beta, specs like Balance Druid, specs like Feral Druid, specs like BM, specs like Havoc, specs like Outlaw all fall into this bottom tier level. We can also add Shadow Priest as well in this list. And then for different reasons, which we will be explaining, we can also add specs like Arms and specs like Devastation Evoker. The reasons are simple. The reasons are that some of these specs are either been doing badly consistently in the beta, or they have been doing perhaps not nearly as terribly, but they have other specs in their class doing significantly better, putting them at risk at being played in the next expansion. For example, Devastation. Devastation is not doing, bad right now. It's not a bad spec. It's not Balance Druid level. It's not even Outlaw level. It would be in a tier list of power. They will be, here, right? They will be doing okay. However, this exists, and that's a problem. When this exists, the value of this and the value of this go down significantly. That's all there is to the Evoker problem right now for augmentation. Now, other specs have more options, because right now, Arcane is also here, but Fire Mage and Frost Mage don't go nearly as much low down. Perhaps you could just slap them a casual pension fund, because, you're not... How much are you risking as Frost if Frost ends up being a meme when Arcane is here? Obviously, if you are a Frost Mage only player, then you're a gambler and you need help, right? But if you are willing to respec within your same class, then you are in a pretty safe position when you're playing Frost Mage, and same for Fire Mage, because your position is not nearly at risk given the power level as one of your other specs. You could be saying and giving the same treatment to Devastation, but augmentation is so much of a different spec in the way it works, in the way you do damage, in the way you actually have to play the spec compared to Frost versus Arcane or Fire versus Arcane, which is vastly different. Talking about stonks secured and a very certain spot in the next expansion, we're not putting the two specs we have mentioned doing very well this high, because we are putting them next to the rest of the class, next to Blood Decay, because this is a conflict of interest. It's unlikely, I'm not gonna say it's guaranteed, but it is unlikely that you're gonna be seeing both of these specs or both of these specs in the same Mythic Plus comp, in the same high-level title-pushing comp in the next expansion. Right now, though, all three specs are doing well. The Decay specs are doing well in single target, they are doing well in AoE, they have good timings with their cooldowns, especially if the augmentation Evoker being meta is gonna play Scale Commander to get cooldown reduction with Breath of Eons, making it a 90-second cooldown. You have Unholy with 90-second cooldowns with Razor Abomination and Unholy Assault, and one every 90-second cooldowns. You can use also Army of the Dead. They line up very well together, but Blood Decay is also doing very well. So they all three have a high return chance, especially because they can also be played in the raid together. This is much more likely to happen in a raid environment than in Mythic Plus, so the return chance of being good in the next expansion is still quite high. Not quite nearly as secured, though. Another spec down the line that is going to be quite risky to play at the moment are the Hunters. We have already put BM Hunter very low down because at the moment it's been doing the worst out of the Hunter specs. Marksmanship Hunter is not doing that much better, also after being nerfed multiple times in Sentinel. The one who has risked the least is Survival. Survival has a high risk, high return because number one, they are generally speaking very underplayed, right? They had their time to shine, at this point 2 years ago, basically, in the last couple of seasons of Shadowlands. But then once Dragonflight began, Hunters this expansion have not had too great of a time in Mythic Plus, and they have not been particularly impressive when it comes to damage overall in Dragonflight either. So you do have the high return chance that Survival ends up being the best Hunter, ends up being played, for example, in a meta comp in Mythic Plus, or to be the only Hunter played in the raid because you're trying to make up the list of range DPS you want to bring, and maybe now you want to bring Elemental, maybe now you want to bring even more Augmentation Evokers, more Arcane Mages, more Warlocks. You don't have spots for ranged Hunters, so the only Hunter gets demoted to being a melee spec. However, there is also the high risk. There is the high risk that Survival is traditionally not really popular. The fact that the high risk might be that there are going to be other melee specs being stronger than you. Like right now, you have the DK specs, you have Fury Warrior doing better than you. So yes, Survival right now is doing quite decent, but it is still quite risky to opt for Survival. Now, after approximately 37, I'm told, bug fixes, you have both of the rogue specs right now. Now, this is a bit more tricky because these two specs do bring a raid debuff you want to have, right? Atrophic Poison, basically a reverse Devotion Aura that you attach to the enemies instead, and you always want a rogue in your group. So, no matter where we are putting rogues, they are still going to have one spot in the raid. That's the first thing that's gonna happen in the War Within. So in the imaginary scenario, you are a raid focused rogue and you only care about raiding and you are the only rogue in your guild, then pretty much all 3 rogue specs would be chilling in the pension fund. And the spec you want to play, or the strongest specs, would be in stocks secured, because you're gonna have your raid spot. And if that's what you care about, then that's what you're gonna be. Obviously, when you have to also put Mythic Plus into the mix, it becomes much more risky, right? If you're more into Mythic Plus than you are into the raid, then at the moment they are not faring too well. They're not faring too well because there are 1, 2, 3, 4 at least melee DPS specs doing better than them, and also another 3 or 4 or 5 ranged DPS specs doing better than them in Mythic Plus. So it's much more high risk for you to be playing one of the rogue specs in Mythic Plus. But as mentioned, for the raid, if you are raid focused as a rogue, and if you are the only rogue in your guild, in your comp, then it's much more safer for you. Now, some of the other remaining specs. We have a gacha addict problem for playing Ret Paladin, and also a reasonably high return chance for playing Fury. Situation for Ret is very risky for 2 reasons. Reason number 1, Holy Paladin is doing very good in your class. So if you were hoping to be a rogue, where you want to have at least a rogue in the group, so you always get your spot, that's gonna be taken away by Holy Paladin. Even worse now that the Ret aura is gone, so you no longer have the bullshit where you have to bring 2 paladins into the raid. You don't even have that anymore, so your spot in the raid is not nearly as safe in the War Within. Your spot in Mythic Plus, as mentioned, you currently have at least 3 different melee DPS specs doing better than you in Mythic Plus right now. You still have the problem that even in Mythic Plus, Holy Paladin is doing very well, so you have to be willing to bet a lot if you were playing Ret Paladin. Now, the situation for Fury is a bit of a mix between high return chance or high risk, high return, depending on... A lot of it will depend on Prot Warrior. That's it. It's gonna be about whether or not Prot Warrior will make it as part of the meta comp in Mythic Plus, for example, or not. However, right now you still have enough power, for example, to be very good in the raid. That's why you have a higher return chance. You're not nearly as much of a gimmick of doing, for example, only good in the raid, or having a raid buff like a rogue to be brought in the raid. You are a bit more versatile in both raid and Mythic Plus. So you suffer slightly less than other specs by having possibly another powerful spec in a different role, like Protection Warrior looks like it's going to be in the War Within. We have still left the Warlock specs. I would put all 3 Warlock specs right here, to be honest, at this point. If I really wanted to just base it on the tier list of damage, then I would put Affliction right over here and Destruction lower down. But it still boils down to, if you're playing Warlock and you're willing to play all of the specs, then you're practically always safe, because one of these 3 will be strong. Right now, Affliction is very strong in single target, even in 2 or 3 target cleave, they're still doing very well. Demonology is also doing very well in AoE right now. Destruction, as mentioned, purely in terms of results, is the one that is lagging down a little bit more compared to the other 2 Demonology specs, so technically they would be in pure gambling territory compared to both Affliction and Demo, but as mentioned, you are risking much less than Ret. You cannot be put in the same level of Ret, or in the same level of Preservation Evoker that has a much stronger spec in a different role, because you have Demo and Affliction. So your risk of playing Destruction is only a risk if you are a stubborn Destruction only player. If you are a stubborn Destruction only player, then you are here. You are really risking a lot by only playing Destro. But if you're willing to play other Warlock specs, then this is not really gonna hurt you too much. You're risking a lot playing Destro, you have a high return, because even if it ends up failing, you can still, default back to one of the 2 currently stronger Warlock specs at the moment in the beta. We have left Windwalker out, which is pure gacha addiction, because the aforementioned power at the moment of Mystery Monk doing very well, and because at the moment, as a melee spec, you're not doing particularly well compared to multiple other specs in terms of DPS. So your chances of being brought over specs that are doing better than you, and on top of that, after being brought over them, the chances of Mistweaver also not being brought, it's rather low. It's a rather risky take to try to bet on Windwalker, especially because similar to Ret, you don't have any other, options as a DPS in your class. The last two, we have the Shaman, the post-rework Shaman specs. The only reason why they are not here is because I'm expecting a few more nerfs, especially to Elemental at the moment. They are doing very well. Overall, especially Elemental is doing very well. It's amongst the best DPS specs right now, together with Augmentation and possibly Arcane and the 2 DK specs. They have a great damage profile, very high consistent damage. Previously, Elemental was known for having consistent damage, but it was mediocre consistent damage. It was flat consistent damage. Now, their consistent damage is very high. They also have much more powerful cooldowns to line up, as well as very often being able to be in Ascendance anyways because of DRE. Very high single target damage. They can still do very high AoE damage in Mythic Plus as well. So they are, at the moment, one of the more well-rounded and all-rounded specs. Not to mention, of course, the addition of the raid buff given to Elemental and Enhancement and the rest of Shaman. So with this list, we wanted to highlight not really just the power of the specs, as in, here's a tier list of their DPS, so you get to pick who is doing very well in DPS because it's going to be strong in the next expansion, but rather a combination of things. Their current performance in the beta, but also how other specs in their class are doing. If you could have, for example, a conflict of interest between certain specs in the same class, their current power in the raid as well as the one in Mythic Plus, and how you could have certain problems in forming powerful Mythic Plus compositions. So it's not really just about their power right now. If this was a power tier list, a DPS tier list, then Devastation would be up here, Affliction would be up here, you would have Rest of Shaman being up here for healers, you would have Frost Mage and Fire Mage being one tier down, maybe Frost a couple of tiers down, Preservation Evoker will go up much more in terms of their results. This was less so about looking at their results and simply telling you play X spec because X spec is OP right now, but rather looking at the broader picture, not just at their power, but what class they are playing, what possible conflict they might have in the same class with other specs being powerful, perhaps of a different role, perhaps that's gonna be bad for your chances at being popular in Mythic Plus, for example, or in the raid, and in general how risky is it going to be to play some of these specs. Obviously, of course, a lot of this will still depend on how willing you are to respec and to play multiple specs. Obviously, it's gonna be much less bad for you, Arms Warrior, given that Fury Warrior is doing much better. Same goes if you are a Devastation Evoker who is willing to punish himself and play Augmentation, etc, etc. So this one was our recap for today, the state of specs and their chances of becoming a popular, powerful pick in the War Within, not just based on their current power, but also a few other points. So for today, on this Monday, I believe, start of the new week, we are now leaving each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, for having watched the video, as well as for supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, we will see. Another thing to screenshot, to check in about a couple of months to see how correct this was.